2:40 a.m. A fuel storage terminal in the Moscow region, the tank farm lit only by perimeter floodlights. A single drone is 40 kilometers out and descending, its engine note dropping below the wind. The duty crew on the fence line has seconds, not minutes, to understand what is closing on them. This is the deep strike campaign against Russian energy infrastructure, and the math is brutal for Moscow. A one-way attack drone built for a few $1,000s. A storage complex defended by an S-400 battalion, and a ring of Pantsir systems costing many times more. 40 kilometers of final approach. One impact that will burn for 19 hours. So how does a slow drone with a lawnmower-sized engine get past one of the densest air defense rings in Russia and still reach the tanks? Since October 2025, Ukraine's long-range strike program has shifted from occasional headline hits to a sustained campaign. Lyuty-type drones, FP-1 cruise munitions built under the Firepoint program, and a handful of other airframes now fly against refineries, pumping stations, and storage terminals on a near-weekly schedule. The targets sit deep inside Russia, some of them far closer to Moscow than to the front line they are supposed to supply. Fuel is not a side issue in this war. Diesel moves armor to the line. Aviation fuel keeps glide bomb carriers airborne. Refined products are also one of the few export streams still funding the war effort under sanctions.
Every burned tank farm is simultaneously a logistics problem for the front and a revenue problem for the Kremlin. This campaign did not appear overnight. Ukraine spent 2023 and 2024 building manufacturing capacity for long-range strike drones almost from scratch, scaling domestic production while foreign supply chains for components stayed informal and improvised. By late 2025, monthly strike volume against Russian energy infrastructure had grown enough that Russian air defense planners were reportedly reshuffling Pantsir coverage on a near-weekly basis just to keep up. The terminal in this story sits south of Moscow, a tank farm built to hold tens of thousands of tons of refined fuel before it moves north by rail and pipeline. On paper, it is one of the better defended sites in the region, sitting inside the outer ring of Moscow's S-400 coverage with a mobile Pantsir detachment rotated through on short notice. In practice, that protection was built to stop a missile or a manned aircraft. Nobody designed it to stop a propeller-driven drone flying low through a river valley at night. Here is the asymmetry that defines this entire campaign. A single FP-1 munition costs roughly what a Russian unit spends on a few days of fuel for one tank. The air defense network protecting this terminal, radars, missiles, crews, maintenance, runs into the billions. One side is trying to make every shot count. The other is trying to defend everything, everywhere, all the time.
That is not a fair fight for the defender. The question by mid-March 2026 was no longer whether Ukraine could reach targets this deep. It was whether Russia could find any combination of radar, jamming, and interceptors that actually stopped one. Geolocation analysts and several independent OSINT trackers spent weeks cross-referencing satellite imagery, customs data on rail shipments, and partisan reporting from inside Russia before this terminal moved up the target list. One detail kept showing up. Tank cars loading at this site matched fuel deliveries reported near a logistics hub feeding Russian units in the Pokrovsk direction. Analysts also flagged something in the terminal's layout that would matter more than any radar on its perimeter. The largest storage tank sat barely 20 meters from its neighbor, with no real firebreak between them. Nobody in Ukrainian planning cells said so outright, but that detail was already shaping how many drones this strike would need and where the first one would aim. Getting a current picture of the site's air defense rotation was not simple. Pantsir detachments around Moscow move between sites on short rotations specifically to deny attackers a predictable schedule, and a stretch of low cloud in February had limited satellite passes over the area for nearly 2 weeks.
Planners worked around it by leaning on signals intelligence, tracking when the local Pantsir radar actually came on the air, rather than waiting to see the vehicle itself. By early March, the picture was clear enough. Ukrainian General Staff sources later described the terminal as a priority target precisely because it sat in a gap. It was defended against the threats Russia expected and exposed to the one it didn't. The order to commit airframes against this terminal went out in the first week of March. What happened over the next several hours would test every assumption built into Moscow's air defense math. The strike package launched from staging points in western and central Ukraine well before midnight, coordinated through Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, alongside the intelligence services that had built the original target package. It was not one drone. Multiple airframes flew on staggered timing and separated routes. Some were slower decoys meant purely to light up Russian radar and draw a reaction. Others flew low through river valleys and tree lines, chosen specifically to sit below radar horizon for as long as possible. From a Russian radar operator's screen, the picture looked manageable. A scatter of slow contacts, some clearly drones, tracked and engaged as they crossed the outer defensive ring. From the ground, in the valley, the lead strike drone was using his cover. The picture looked like nothing at all. No radar return, no warning.
3 of the decoy drones were intercepted within the first 20 minutes, exactly as Ukrainian planners expected. That part of the night was already a success by Russian standards. What nobody on the Russian side understood yet was that the intercepted drones were never the real threat. The strike drone meant for the tank farm was already past the outer ring, flying a route that kept it almost entirely out of radar line of sight. Russian electronic warfare units did get a partial lock on the strike drone's navigation signal, roughly 30 kilometers out, enough to push its course off by a few hundred meters. It was not enough. Modern strike drones in this campaign increasingly fly on inertial navigation, with satellite positioning as a backup rather than a dependency, and the drone simply continued on dead reckoning, correcting itself once it passed beyond the jamming bubble. By the time a Pantsir crew assigned to the terminal's outer perimeter got a usable radar return, the drone was inside 10 kilometers and descending. The crew had a window measured in tens of seconds, not minutes, to acquire, lock, and fire. The target was flying low enough that ground clutter was already fighting their own radar. That window came and went without a shot. The strike drone crossed the perimeter fence line at low altitude, lined up on the largest storage tank in the complex, and began its final dive. It was not flying alone.
2 more strike drones, launched on different routes earlier that night, were converging on the same terminal from different bearings, timed to arrive within minutes of each other. The plan called for a sequence of hits, designed to overwhelm whatever firefighting response the site could muster before the second and third impacts landed. 2:47. The first strike drone hit the largest tank in the farm almost dead center. The warhead does not need to be enormous against a target like this. It only needs to breach the tank wall and ignite the vapor space above the fuel line. It did both. The initial blast was followed within seconds by a secondary explosion as fuel vapor inside the tank caught. These strike drones are not technologically exotic. Composite airframes, a small piston engine, a payload in the tens of kilograms, and navigation that increasingly relies on satellite positioning backed up by inertial reference rather than any exotic sensor suite. What makes them effective isn't sophistication. It's a radar cross-section small enough and a flight profile low enough that point defense systems built to intercept missiles and aircraft often never get a clean engagement window at all. What's most surprising about the footage that surfaced afterward isn't the first explosion. Large fuel tank fires look dramatic on any night. It's how fast the fire jumped to the neighboring tank.
That 20-meter gap analysts had flagged weeks earlier turned out to be exactly as thin as they warned. The second strike drone arrived 4 minutes later, aimed at a tank already showing radiant heat damage from the first fire. It did not need precision targeting at that point. The fire itself was now the easiest target marker on the site. Confirmation came almost immediately, a second column of flame, visibly taller than the first. Site firefighting crews tried to establish a foam perimeter around the undamaged tanks, the standard response to contain a tank farm fire before it spreads. The obstacle was straightforward and brutal. The facility's own foam reserve had not been resupplied since a routine drill the previous autumn, and the volume on hand was barely a third of what a fire this size required. Crews improvised with water cannons, which cool a tank shell but do almost nothing to smother a vapor fire. The third drone hit closer to 0310, against a tank on the opposite side of the farm from the first 2 impacts. That was a deliberate choice, meant to split the firefighting response rather than let crews concentrate everything on one side. Put yourself in the site commander's position at that moment. 3 tanks burning on 2 sides of the same facility, foam running low, no reinforcement due for at least another hour.
Do you concentrate every asset on saving the one tank you can still realistically protect, or split your crews thin and hope to slow all 3 fires at once? Either choice costs you something. What would you have done? Tell us in the comments. There's no clean answer here. In the end, the site commander split his crews. By 04, 3 of the terminal storage tanks were fully engaged, and a 4th was showing heat stress damage along its seams. Out of a complex built to hold several tens of thousands of tons of refined product, roughly a third of total capacity was now either burning or at serious risk of catching. Here's what this tells us about the current phase of this war. Depth is no longer protection. For most of 2022 and 2023, distance from the front line was itself a form of defense. Russian logistics planners built around the assumption that anything past a certain radius was simply out of reach. That assumption has been wrong for well over a year now, and sites like this terminal are still being defended as if it were still true. Here's the take that will probably draw some pushback. The failure at this terminal sits less with the air defense crews than with whoever signed off on the foam reserve shortfall.
A Pantsir crew working a 40-second engagement window against a low, slow target in radar clutter was always going to be a coin flip.
A fire department running at a third of its required suppressant load, 8 months after a drill flagged the gap, was a choice. That one is on facility management, not the soldiers on the perimeter. Russian officials described the incident publicly as drone debris causing a localized fire at an industrial facility, contained within hours. From the ground, that is roughly what it looked like by daylight: smoke, foam residue, a damaged tank farm being assessed. From above, satellite thermal imagery told a different story: heat signatures consistent with at least 2 tanks still smoldering more than 19 hours after the first impact. Russian milbloggers covering the incident were considerably less measured than the official statement. Several posted that the facility's own air defense detachment had been rotated out the week prior for maintenance and had not yet been fully replaced. That's exactly the kind of gap OSINT analysts had been tracking for weeks. Intercepted radio traffic reviewed by open-source analysts captured a Pantsir operator repeating a target designation that never resolved into a track. The tactical damage matters less than the tempo cost. This terminal fed rail shipments toward at least one logistics hub supporting Russian operations in the Pokrovsk sector. With roughly a third of storage capacity offline and structural inspection required before refilling any of the damaged tanks, those shipments did not simply pause.
They had to reroute through facilities already running near capacity, adding days to a supply chain that frontline units depend on running like clockwork. This is the pattern across the entire refinery and storage campaign now. There's rarely one knockout strike. Instead, it's a steady accumulation of damage that Russian logistics never quite catches up on. Subscribe to Fury Military if you want to keep tracking how this deep strike campaign evolves and why Russian air defense keeps losing this particular math problem. By sunrise, the strike was officially over. 3 confirmed impacts, 2 sustained tank fires, and a third tank with damage serious enough that engineers later recommended draining it entirely rather than risk a delayed rupture. None of it required a missile. None of it required an aircraft inside Russian airspace. It required 3 drones, a known gap in radar coverage, and a fire department that had been quietly under-resourced for months. Independent estimates of the fuel lost ran into the low thousands of tons, a fraction of Russia's national reserves, but a meaningful chunk of what this single terminal was meant to move north in a given week. More importantly, the terminal stayed offline for repair and inspection well into the following month. It contributed nothing to a supply chain that had been running at full throughput just days earlier. Most people assume an attack like this gets patched fast, a damaged tank repaired, throughput restored within days.
The evidence here says otherwise. Structural inspection on a tank that has been through a vapor space fire is not optional, and Russia's own industry reporting from similar incidents earlier in the campaign put realistic repair timelines at 6 to 10 weeks, not days. This terminal is now one entry in a list that has grown long since October 2025. Refineries in the Volga region, storage terminals near the Black Sea coast, pumping stations along pipeline routes feeding the front. Across the broader campaign, Ukrainian strikes have hit dozens of refineries, pumping stations, and storage terminals since the deep strike effort scaled up in 2024. Russian industry estimates briefly cited refining capacity reductions in the high single digits as a national percentage during the worst weeks of that campaign. Those numbers were serious enough that fuel shortages reached civilian filling stations in several regions, not just military logistics. As for the Pantsir crew that never got a clean shot that night, open-source trackers later identified the unit's call sign from the intercepted chatter. There is no public record of disciplinary action, but the unit was reassigned to a different sector within 3 weeks, a personnel move Russian command rarely explains and rarely needs to. What this terminal exposed wasn't a single broken radar or a single under-resourced fire department. It was a defensive doctrine still built around point defense against a handful of expensive, predictable threats: ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, manned aircraft, applied to a threat environment that now includes dozens of cheap, slow, low-flying drones approaching from directions nobody pre-planned for. That's really the story underneath every one of these strikes, not just this one. A drone that costs a few $1,000s forced a response from a battalion-level air defense network worth orders of magnitude more, and still got through. This is what a sensor-driven, attrition-by-arithmetic war looks like. Relentless pressure applied cheaply against a defender who has to be right everywhere, every night, while the attacker only has to be right once.
By the following week, the terminal's tank farm was a patchwork of drained tanks, scorched concrete, and a repair schedule running well past the original spring deadline Russian planners had set for resupply ahead of any new offensive push. None of this required a single Ukrainian soldier to cross the border. It required reconnaissance, patience, and 3 airframes flown well enough to exploit a gap that had been visible in open-source imagery for weeks before the strike. The lesson for anyone studying this war isn't really about one burned tank farm in the Moscow region.
It's about what happens when distance stops being a defense, and air defense networks built for a different era get asked to cover gaps they were never designed for. A target can begin to lose the moment it is seen, and increasingly in this war, being seen is no longer hard. So here's a real question worth sitting with. As this refinery and storage campaign grinds into its second year, does Russia ever actually close this gap? Or does air defense built around missiles and aircraft simply stay structurally unsuited to stopping cheap, slow drones flown with patience? Comment your prediction. Closes within a year, or this keeps happening through 2027? There's a bigger question behind that one too. Mechanized logistics, rail yards, pipeline hubs, fuel terminals were built for a century of warfare where reaching this deep meant deploying bombers or missiles that a state could realistically intercept or deter. Can traditional rear area infrastructure survive in a war where a few $1,000s buys enough range and guidance to reach almost anywhere behind the line? That question applies well beyond this one war. For Moscow, the terminal will eventually be repaired, restaffed, and probably better defended than it was in March. For Ukraine, it is one more data point in a campaign built on the simple premise that the war does not have to stay only at the front to change what happens at the front.
If you want the next reconstruction the moment new geolocation data and battle damage imagery surface, subscribe to Fury Military. This campaign isn't slowing down, and neither is the analysis. This analysis isn't meant to glorify war. It's meant to help us understand the military and human realities behind it, because seeing this conflict clearly is what makes the case for deterrence and peace harder to ignore.